If you enjoy the story, give it a like and feel free to leave a comment. Also, be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon to be the first to hear new cryptid tales. I'm always looking for stories to share, so if you've had your own encounter with the unknown, send me an email at cryptidtalesmel@gmail.com.
What I'm about to tell you is hard to believe. For some, it will be downright impossible. If I was listening to some guy tell me this story, especially a stranger, there's no way I'd ever believe it. I'm not sure if I'd just laugh or tell him he's full of it, but that's the reaction I've always expected from others. And that's why there's a very small group of people who have heard this story. My wife and brother being two of them, my best friend who is no longer with us being the only other. I don't get on the internet much, but my wife likes to listen to Bigfoot stories and read about other people's sightings, and insisted on me writing up my story and sending it in. She thinks it will help. For years, the incident has given me nightmares, and after hearing what happened, you'll understand why. I was never into hunting, really, but my best friend grew up in a hunting family and loved it. When we got older, year after year, he'd try to talk me into going with him, and eventually I finally agreed. It wasn't that I was against hunting, I just didn't understand it. I can go to the grocery store and buy meat or whatever food I want, so I didn't understand what the point was of going out and killing an animal for food. Live and let live. He had always hunted with his dad, but then his dad passed away. I guess that's one of the reasons I finally agreed to go. Hunting deer was just something he did. It was part of him. But after his dad passed, seeing how depressed he got that first season without him, well, I didn't want to see my friend like that anymore. So I told him if he'd provide the gear, I'd go shoot at Bambi with him. That following deer season, I found myself dressed head to toe in camo and headed for the woods before sunrise. My friend had a deer lease and had already set up some tree stands on the property. It was the same patch of land he and his dad had always hunted, so I trusted that he knew what he was doing. Now, while I wasn't a hunter, I was still familiar with guns. I enjoyed shooting guns and owned a few myself. What I didn't own was any sort of deer rifle. My friend solved the issue by allowing me to use his rifle, and he took his father's. We both thought that was a nice sentiment, and for him, I think it felt a little more like his dad was with him. We pulled up to the old rusty cattle gate with a trickle of light showing up on the horizon. I jumped out and unwrapped the chain from around the fence post and yanked the gate back so he could drive in. After I got the gate closed, we drove down what I guess you would call a road. It was just a couple of worn lanes of tire tracks going through the field, and headed towards a finger of trees. You could just see their tops before they disappeared back down into the darkness of the bottoms. "That's where we're setting up today," he said, as he pointed one finger towards the trees, never taking his hand off the steering wheel. I picked up the coffee thermos and unscrewed the lid. I did my best to pour myself some while trying not to let it slosh out all over my lap as the truck bounced and rocked down the old road. He cut the wheel next to the tree line and threw it in park, cutting the headlights off. He got himself one last drink of coffee before turning off the engine and stepping out into the crisp morning air. We grabbed the rifles out of their old worn cases from behind the seat and did our best not to slam the doors shut. Everything was quiet. A few small birds took flight out of the tree we were parked by, chirping their discontent at us as they flew off. I threw the rifle sling over my shoulder, and we headed towards the woods. He led the way with a small headlamp. I just followed behind, thinking we were for sure going to get lost, but before too long I could tell he could have found his way around those woods with his eyes closed. I thought to myself how many years had he and his father been going out there, but I didn't ask. I guess I didn't want to drudge anything up, and was hoping he would enjoy being out there again, doing something he loved. After hiking for a while, we arrived at the tree stand I'd be in that day. It wasn't as high up as I thought it would be, just a ladder climb about 12 feet up, but he assured me it was plenty high, which was fine with me. I didn't like the idea of sitting in a tree all day as it was. The lower the better. Once I was settled in the stand, he told me that he'd be hunting about a half a mile to the west of me and took off for his own stand. I watched as his light got fainter and fainter until it was gone completely. Now I was alone, and I have to admit, it was kind of spooky. The light was getting brighter on the horizon, and my eyes were starting to adjust. I couldn't see much, but I wasn't completely in the dark. I knew it might be all day before he came and got me to head back to the truck. I thought to myself that if I was lucky, he'd get a deer pretty early, and I might not have to be perched in this tree for the entire day. After all, in my mind, I was out there for him, not to actually shoot and kill a deer. I had thought about wearing my watch out there, but I figured I would just end up torturing myself with it by constantly checking the time, so I had left it on the nightstand at home. I could tell it had been a while since we got out there, maybe a couple hours. I couldn't see the sun. It looked like it was going to be a cloudy day, but it was at least daylight now. Far off to the right of me, I heard some limbs breaking. Just a couple of sharp snaps interrupting the quiet. Enough to make me hold my breath for a couple seconds. I tried to guesstimate how far away it was, but wasn't sure. Time passed, maybe another 30 minutes, and then another limb snap. This time much louder and a little closer, but more behind me than to the right. I leaned over trying to look around the tree, but the trunk was too wide for me to see all the way around it. All went quiet again. As I sat there, I pictured a huge buck walking out of the tree cover in my mind. What if I actually had the chance to shoot one? Would I do it? I had heard people talking about buck fever and not being able to pull the trigger when faced with the reality of the situation. Would this happen to me? It's not something I had ever really thought about. Crash! The sound of what seemed like an elephant breaking through the trees behind me jerked me right out of my daydreaming and back into reality. What the hell was that? I strained my neck and twisted as far as I could, trying to see what was behind me, but I still just couldn't get the right vantage point. Again, everything went quiet, other than some birds in the distance, angrily chirping away. Maybe the same ones we had disturbed on the way in. I thought to myself that it must be a huge deer, maybe even a cow or something. Were there cows on this property? Would they wander way down into the woods like this? Whatever it was, it sounded huge. Another half hour or so went by, and I never once felt back at ease. I was still on high alert, trying to listen, or get a glimpse of whatever it was. I was almost certain it was still back there. I certainly didn't hear anything leave. Then that question was answered. At first, I wasn't sure of what I was hearing. It was very quiet, but no, I was right. I could hear something slowly taking steps. First, I'd hear it behind me and to the right, and then behind me and to the left, like something was pacing behind me about 30 feet away or so. The weird thing? It sounded like someone slowly walking, like a person. This went on for what seemed like an hour, but was most likely just a few minutes. With each step, I became more and more tense. I was almost positive that someone was messing with me. Now, I may have never been hunting before, but I knew one of the main rules of hunting was to stay quiet, and up until that point I had done just that. But now, I didn't care. I knew it wasn't my friend messing with me, so who was it? "Hello?" I called out. The pacing stopped. I waited for someone to respond back, but got nothing. "Hey, me and my buddy are hunting here." Still nothing. All I could hear was my own breathing. Whack! A large stick, small limb, whatever you want to call it, slammed against the trunk of the tree I was in, shaking it in the whole stand. A piece of the limb went somersaulting past the trees in front of me, landing on the ground about 15 feet away. I nearly jumped out of my own skin. "Hey!" I yelled, trying to sound as angry as I could, but in reality, I was scared, even though I was the one with the gun. I heard footsteps running away behind me, off into the woods, accompanied by limb snaps here and there. I stayed frozen until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was going on. All I knew is I didn't want to be in that tree stand for a second more. Somebody was out there playing games, but I did have a gun. Nobody would mess with a stranger holding a gun. Nobody in their right mind, at least. This just made the situation even more confusing, and at the same time, terrifying. I did my best to focus and keep my thoughts from getting tangled up together. I decided my best course of action was to get down out of the stand and maybe try to find my way back to the truck. Looking back, I should have just stayed in the stand and fired off the rifle a couple times. At the time, I didn't even think of that. At the time, it seemed like the safest place was to be back at the truck, with a huge field behind me and not up in the tree surrounded by woods. I was even willing to bet he had left the doors unlocked, since we were supposed to be the only people out there, and a few honks of the horn would bring him right to me, and then we could get out of there. I was done with my hunting experience. I stood up in the stand and listened again, to make sure I couldn't hear anything walking around, and then made my way down the ladder and back onto solid ground. I could now see where the bark was busted where they had slapped the tree limb against it, and a lump filled my throat. I stood there for a moment getting my bearings, and then with a fair degree of certainty, headed off in the direction of the truck, or at least the direction of the field if nothing else. I was down in the bottom, so I knew if I headed back in that direction and started going uphill, I was going the right way. After walking for a while, I started feeling sick to my stomach. Maybe it was the adrenaline wearing off. Maybe it had been so long since I had eaten something. I wasn't sure, but I needed to stop. I pulled out one of the granola bars I had stashed in the inside pocket of my jacket and sat down at the base of a tree. My mind started drifting off back to the thoughts of what had happened. The crashing sound, the pacing footsteps, the feeling of the tree shaking when the limb hit it. I wondered if they had messed with my friend, if they even knew he was out there. I tried to figure out how they had even found me, or if it was just dumb luck. Had they watched us walk in? I didn't see any other signs of vehicles out there. What were they hoping to accomplish? All these questions motivated me even more to get to the truck. I tossed the last bite of granola bar in my mouth and crinkled up the wrapper as I tucked it back into my pocket. I stood up, slung the rifle back over my shoulder, and took maybe half a step before I saw it. Standing there in front of me, maybe 15 feet away, was a small, hair-covered creature. It was standing on two legs. It was maybe 4 feet tall, but looked like it had some weight to it. It had light brown hair, not fur, but hair like a dog or a horse's mane maybe. It was hair, and it covered its entire body, except for around the eyes. There were streaks of darker brown around the shoulders and on the upper legs. The hair on its face was definitely thinner than the rest, like a little kid with a short beard. The hair on its head, arms, and legs was longer than the rest. It looked almost like a little kid standing there, if it weren't for the hair and the eyes. The eyes were larger and darker than a person would have. The arms seemed to hang down lower, but the thing, it wasn't human. The thing looked wild. I was frozen in my footsteps. I'm sure I stopped breathing. I was literally in shock. I had no idea what I was even looking at, Bigfoot was not something I had ever even given thought to, let alone toy with the idea that it might actually exist. So even then, I wasn't even thinking Bigfoot. I thought some sort of little wild child or some sort of exotic ape, unlike anything I had ever seen before. We stood there staring at one another, and I could tell it was as freaked out as I was. It was breathing heavily, and its large brow area was pressed down hard over its eyes, like it was trying to understand what it was looking at as much as I was. I started to notice a smell, a horrible smell all around me. The thing clenched its fists, and I noticed that the hair on the back of its hands were less hairy like its face. It bared its teeth and wrinkled its nose and started to growl, a deep rumbling growl like you would expect from an animal. But as much as this thing wasn't a human, it wasn't an animal either. I felt my face go flush as sheer panic raced through my veins like ice water. Without even thinking, I raised the rifle to my shoulder and slid my finger in front of the trigger. Trying to remember back, I don't know if I had intentions of actually pulling the trigger, or if I was just hoping it would recognize what a gun was and run away. All I know is I was scared, more so than I had ever been, and I wanted it to stop. I remember looking down the side of the rifle scope and down the barrel at the thing, and it taking a step back. Suddenly, the rifle jerked and pulled out of my grip, wrenching my finger inside the trigger guard. It was like it had been pulled straight up into the air and was gone. I pivoted around quickly, tripping myself and falling onto the ground. Standing over me was another creature, a giant, muscular creature, the largest thing I've ever seen in my life on two legs. It stood there, eyes locked on me, holding the rifle by the stock. It looked like a toy in its huge hand. The giant was probably, 8-10 feet tall. Its hair looked thicker and was dark brown, almost black. The skin on its face was darker and wrinkled, and the eyes big and dark like the little one. If you compared the smaller one to a chimpanzee, this would have been a silverback gorilla. This thing was so intimidating, I'm not even going to lie. I soiled myself right then and there. Laugh if you want to, think it's funny, but I bet you would have done the same thing in that situation if that giant, angry creature had been standing over you in the woods. The only thing I could relate it to is the feeling you might have if you were out swimming in the middle of the ocean and a great white swam by. I was completely at this thing's mercy. Without taking its eyes off of me, it slowly raised the rifle up to its nose and sucked in. Its head jerked back and it pulled the rifle away with a look of disgust. A deep growl rumbled from inside its chest, and I could see its pectoral muscles rippling. It looked towards the little one and made a clicking sound with its mouth. I turned my head as little as possible, just enough to see the little one out of the corner of my eye, and saw it dart off into the woods without making a sound. The big one let out a snort of air, which caused me to immediately turn my full attention back towards it. It made a grunt sound and bared its teeth with a snarl. I thought that was it. It was going to attack me. I was going to die. I started to slowly scoot myself backwards, away from it as much as I could without making any sudden movements. I didn't know what else to do. I just knew I had to try to do something. I had put about 5 more feet between us when it let out another grunt and slammed its fist down on the ground, dropping to all fours and letting the rifle fall to the ground next to it. I didn't even think about trying to make a move for the rifle. There was no way I was going to do that. I flinched, and then once I had regained my nerve a bit, started scooting away from it some more. I had put another 10 feet or so between us when the back of my shoulder bumped a tree trunk. I pulled my knees up and got my feet beneath me and slowly pulled myself up to my feet, using the tree trunk as support. When I stood up, the giant stood back up on 2 legs as well. I took a couple of steps out away from the tree and started slowly walking backwards. I was too afraid to take my eyes off the creature, and its eyes were still glued to me, like it was daring me to screw up. But I guess I already had. It stood up straight, taller than it had before, with its chest puffed out, and let out a roar that shook my entire body and the entire woods around me. It looked down at the rifle and scooped it back up with its hand before swinging it and smacking it against a tree. The stock shattered into splinters and the gun went off. Tree bark on the tree next to me exploded, and I heard the sound of the ricocheting bullet whiz by my ear. The gun going off must have startled the creature. I don't think it was expecting that to happen, and it immediately dropped the rifle and crashed off through the woods at a speed I would describe as almost unnatural. I quickly wheeled around and took off running in the direction of the field. My lungs burned, but I kept trying to run faster with each step I took. I didn't look back to see if the thing was chasing me. I just kept running until I burst out of the tree line and into the open field. Once I was out in the open, I could see the truck a couple 100 yards from where I was. I can only imagine what the scene must have looked like, something out of a horror movie, as I tried to run the rest of the way, even though I was completely out of breath and was probably stumbling and walking fast more so than I was actually running. I got to the truck, and sure enough, the door was unlocked. I pulled myself up onto the seat and pulled the door closed behind me, immediately hitting the lock button. I looked out through the windshield. No creature, no giant. The coast was clear. I started hitting the horn, a long blast and then short blasts, repeated over and over. I don't know how long I honked the horn, until my arm was too tired of reaching over there and honking it. Then I waited. Quicker than I expected, but relieved, I saw my friend emerge from the trees. He held his arms out as if asking me what was going on. I responded with a couple more honks of the horn. When he got to the truck, I leaned over and unlocked his door. He looked at me with a questioning look on his face. I just shook my head no. I scooted up to the front edge of the seat, giving him space to get his rifle stowed away behind the seat. "Where's the other rifle?" he asked. I didn't answer. All I said to him was that I needed him to take me home. It was a long ride back home. I didn't say anything, and he didn't ask. When we were in the safety of my driveway, I started telling him the events that had taken place out in the woods. I told them in order and exactly as they happened. As I told him the story, I started to cry. I was crying from the relief of being home, the relief of him being there with me, both of us making it out of those woods, the relief that I was still alive. I got out of his truck and walked inside my house. It was a couple days before I told my wife. My friend called me about a month after it happened just to let me know he believed me and that he had heard the roar and the gunshot. That's why he was able to make it back to the truck so quickly. He had already been on his way. He also told me that when he went to get the tree stands, mine had been pulled down out of the tree and the ladder had been twisted somehow. Finally, I told my brother. We were at my best friend's funeral 4 years after we had gone out hunting that day. It seemed fitting at the time. And now I have told you, and you can tell others. Maybe someone can benefit from what happened to me, or at least know they aren't alone.